Today, we're going to talk about a 5,000-year-old industry that, for almost all of its history, has been fundamentally broken. We're talking about lending and how AI is completely rewriting the rules of the game.
I mean, that's a pretty bold statement, right? But it's coming from people who've spent their entire careers in the lending world. And what they're saying is that this business, as old as civilization itself, has always been built on a foundation that's, well, nearly impossible to manage.
So what is it that makes it so terrible? Why would an industry that's a cornerstone of our economy be called awful? Well, the answer comes down to this core conflict, a puzzle that has been plaguing lenders for centuries.
And that brings us to the first big idea we need to unpack, what's called the impossible trifecta. You can think of this as the fundamental law of lending for millennia, a law that forced every single lender into a really tough compromise.
Okay, so every lender on the planet wants these three things, right? You want to grow your loan book fast. You want to be super profitable. And of course, you need strong credit performance, meaning, people actually pay you back. But here's the catch. For pretty much all of history, you could get one of these, maybe two if you were lucky. But all three at the same time? Forget it. It was considered impossible.
In such a competitive market, something always had to give. You want to grow really fast? Well, you'd probably have to lower your lending standards. And boom, your credit performance takes a hit. You want to maximize your profits? Okay, but you'll probably have to slow your growth way down. This trade-off was just a given, until AI came along and just completely broke this fundamental law.
Now, to really get how revolutionary this shift is, we need to take a quick look back at how lending decisions were made the old-fashioned way. It was a very simple, almost by-the-book kind of process. So the textbook method was pretty much a three-step process. First, you'd find a handful of simple variables, we're talking maybe 8 to 15 things, that seem to predict risk. Second, you'd plug them into a single, pretty straightforward linear model. But here's the really surprising part. Lenders didn't even use that model directly.
The final step was to simplify that model even more, dumbing it down into something called a scorecard. And why would they do that? Because using the actual mathematical model was considered, and I quote, operationally too complex. The whole system was built for simplicity, not for precision.
So what in the world is a scorecard? Well, it's basically just a simple lookup table. It assigns points based on a few characteristics. A recent delinquency might add 40 risk points. A high FICO score might subtract 60. You just add it all up, and that gives you your decision. Simple, yeah, but not very smart. But then, starting about a decade ago, a totally new approach started to pop up. We began moving away from these simple rules and diving into these complex, machine learning-driven models.
And look, this wasn't an overnight thing. It was this slow, gradual evolution. Back in 2014, innovators figured out that education data was often a better predictor of risk than FICO alone. By 2015, they were combining multiple models together for more accuracy. Then, in 2017, they cracked a really tough nut: how to apply machine learning to long-term data. And by 2018, AI was even being used to optimize the pricing itself.
This quote just perfectly nails the core challenge here. Think about it. In most machine learning problems, like identifying a cat in a photo, you get feedback instantly. Yes, that's a cat. No, that's not. But in lending, you might have to wait 5 whole years to find out if you made a good loan. And that huge delay, that long feedback loop, was the key thing that traditional AI just couldn't get past.
And that brings us to the single biggest innovation in this whole story. It was a fundamental architectural shift that finally solved this long-term data problem and unlocked the true power of AI in lending.
So traditional models asked just one very simple question: will this person eventually pay back their loan? That's it, one prediction. The new loan month model asks a completely different question: will they make their payment this month? And it asks that question for every single month of the loan's life. So for a 5-year loan, you go from making one prediction to making 120 of them.
So why on earth does this matter so much? Okay, let's make this real. Let's look at an example with 2 different borrowers. Now, on paper, a traditional model sees them as completely identical. Same income, same credit history, same FICO score. Twins, basically.
So a traditional model looks at their entire loan term, and it comes to a conclusion. Both borrower A and borrower B have the exact same lifetime probability of default, 12.65%. Because of that, it would offer them the exact same interest rate. But the loan month model sees what the old model completely misses: the timing of that risk.
It sees that borrower A's risk is front-loaded. They're much more likely to default early on. Borrower B's risk is back-loaded. It shows up way later in the loan. Their overall risk is the same, but the pattern is completely different. And that timing changes everything. Because borrower A is riskier right at the beginning, before the lender has collected much interest, the correct price to cover that early risk is a pretty high 16.70%. But for borrower B, since that risk is delayed for years, the lender has already collected a ton of interest payments. So the correct price for their loan is much, much lower, just 13.09%. That's a difference of 361 basis points. That's over 3.5%. A traditional model is forced to be massively wrong for one or maybe even both of these people. This is the gigantic error that the loan month model was built to eliminate.
This breakthrough, this leap in precision, is exactly how the old rules of lending just got shattered. It's what finally makes that impossible trifecta, well, possible. See, by pricing risk with this level of granularity, AI models can tell the difference between individuals instead of just lumping them into these broad, dumb averages. It solves that long-term feedback problem, which lets lenders make smarter decisions and make them faster. And this is the key. They can now approve more of the good borrowers while steering clear of more of the bad ones. And that allows them to finally achieve fast growth, high profitability, and strong credit performance all at the same time. And all of this leaves us with a pretty fascinating question to think about. I mean, the fundamental laws of lending held true for millennia until a new technology came along. It really makes you wonder, what other industries out there have these deeply ingrained, impossible constraints that are just waiting for the right technology to come along and break them wide open?